The heat of the afternoon sun beat down on Marty McFly's back as he guided his horse down the dusty trail toward Hill Valley. The dry wind stirred the earth beneath him, creating small clouds of dust that swirled up from the cracked ground. He adjusted his wide-brimmed hat, squinting through the heat waves that rose from the desert floor, making the distant mountains shimmer like a mirage. It had been only days since he reunited with Doc Brown, but the strange calm of the 1880s still didn't sit well with him. Sure, the Wild West had its charm, the wide-open landscapes, the rugged freedom, but Marty longed for the familiar sounds of car engines and the glow of neon lights. The rattle of horse hooves and the creak of wagon wheels felt foreign, almost unnerving. As much as he appreciated Doc's excitement about their situation, the isolation of the Old West got under Marty's skin. Up ahead, the dusty town of Hill Valley came into view, its wooden structures looking almost fragile against, the harsh, unforgiving landscape. The town wasn't bustling like it had been when they first arrived. The few people that moved about did so with a sense of unease, glancing nervously over their shoulders, their faces pale with worry. Marty furrowed his brow as he slowed his horse to a walk, feeling the weight of something wrong in the air. There was an unsettling quietness in the town today, as if the very land itself was holding its breath. Doc Brown had been hard at work repairing the DeLorean in the barn just outside of town. The old man, always lost in his inventions and ideas, seemed oblivious to the strange tension creeping through the streets. Marty had gone into town to grab some supplies, but as he rode through the main street, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. A lone man stood at the entrance of the saloon, his tattered clothes hanging off him in rags, his face gaunt and pale. He wasn't just drunk, he looked sick. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin had a sickly pallor that sent a chill down Marty's spine. The man's mouth opened and a low guttural sound escaped his throat, more like a growl than speech. "Hey, you all right there?" Marty asked, slowing his horse to a stop. But the man didn't respond. His head snapped to the side, and his glazed eyes fixed on Marty, hollow and devoid of humanity. For a moment, they stared at each other, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Then the man's jaw opened wider, impossibly wide, and with a horrifying snarl, he lunged forward, stumbling toward Marty with outstretched hands. Whoa! Marty yanked on the reins, pulling his horse back as the man collapsed to the ground, convulsing in the dirt. The people around him, already on edge, screamed and backed away. Marty jumped down from his horse and rushed toward the man, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell is happening?" Marty muttered, watching in shock as the man's body twisted unnaturally, his bones cracking audibly beneath his skin. The man's eyes rolled back into his head as his mouth frothed with blood, and with a final grotesque shudder, he went still. Marty knelt down cautiously, his hands hovering above the man's body. The air around him reeked of rot and decay, and Marty could barely suppress the bile rising in his throat. As his fingers touched the man's skin, it was cold, too cold for the heat of the desert. The townspeople had scattered, their fearful murmurs growing into a panicked roar. A woman screamed somewhere nearby, and Marty's head snapped up to see more figures stumbling into the street. People like the man who had just died, their bodies contorted, their eyes glazed and lifeless. "Marty, get back!" Doc's voice cut through the chaos, and Marty turned to see Doc Brown rushing toward him, his usual calm demeanor replaced by wide-eyed fear. "Doc, what's going on?" Marty yelled, stumbling to his feet as more of the sickened townspeople shambled toward them, their skin peeling and flaking, their mouths hanging open in grotesque moans. They moved with a terrifying, jerking speed, closing in faster than seemed possible for their decayed bodies. "I don't know, but it's spreading and fast!" Doc grabbed Marty's arm, pulling him toward the DeLorean. "We need to get out of here, now!" As they ran through the dust-choked street, Marty glanced back at the town. Hill Valley was falling into chaos. The infected townspeople, no longer human, had begun to attack those still alive. Marty saw a man get pulled to the ground by 3 of the creatures, their hands clawing at his flesh as they ripped into him with gnashing teeth. His screams filled the air, sending a shiver down Marty's spine. "Doc, they're killing people. What the hell is happening?" Marty gasped as they ducked into an alley, the sounds of carnage growing louder behind them. Doc's face was pale, his eyes darting around as if searching for answers in the madness. "I don't know, Marty. Some kind of infection. It's spreading faster than anything I've ever seen." They emerged from the alley and sprinted toward the barn, where the DeLorean was hidden. The infected had already swarmed the main street, their grotesque figures lurching toward anything that moved, their dead eyes glinting with hunger. The sound of screams, gunfire, and the wet, sickening crunch of flesh being torn apart filled the air. As they reached the barn, Marty threw open the door, and the 2 of them hurried inside, slamming it shut behind them. The DeLorean sat in the middle of the barn, half repaired, wires spilling out from its opened engine compartment. Marty's chest heaved with exertion as he looked at Doc, panic rising in his voice. "We need to get out of here, Doc. Can't we just leave? Go back to 1985? To any other time but now?" Doc shook his head, wiping the sweat from his brow. "The DeLorean isn't ready, Marty. The flux capacitor's unstable. If we try to time travel now, we could end up anywhere in history, or worse, get trapped in some temporal anomaly. We need more time." Marty glanced at the barn door, hearing the faint scratching and groaning of the infected gathering outside. His stomach twisted with fear. "Doc, I don't think we have more time." Outside, the moans grew louder, and the barn door rattled as the infected began to press against it. The wooden planks creaked under the pressure, and Marty knew it wouldn't hold for long. He felt trapped, the walls closing in around him as the weight of their situation sank in. "Doc, what do we do? We can't stay here," Marty said, his voice trembling. Doc glanced at the half-finished DeLorean, his mind racing. "We'll need to gather supplies, find somewhere safe, and wait this out until we can fix the DeLorean. We need to move fast." Before Marty could respond, the barn door burst open and the infected flooded inside, their grotesque faces twisted in unnatural snarls as they lunged at Marty and Doc, their hands reaching out hungrily. "Run," Doc shouted, grabbing a nearby shovel and swinging it at one of the creatures, knocking it to the ground. Marty's heart pounded in his chest as he bolted toward the back of the barn, dodging the undead that swarmed them. The creatures clawed at his clothes, their decayed fingers grazing his skin. He ducked under their grasp, adrenaline pushing him forward as he fought to stay alive. Doc followed close behind, using the shovel to fend off the advancing infected. "We need to get to the horses. It's the only way out." Marty didn't argue. He ran at the back of the barn, stumbling into the open air, where the horses stood tied to a post. With a swift motion, he untied them, throwing himself into the saddle as Doc did the same. The infected poured out of the barn, their snarls growing louder as they chased after them. "Come on, Doc, let's go," Marty shouted, spurring his horse into a gallop. They raced out of Hill Valley, the sounds of the undead fading behind them as they rode into the open desert. But as they disappeared into the wilderness, Marty couldn't shake the feeling that this nightmare had only just begun. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie red glow across the horizon as Marty and Doc rode away from Hill Valley at full gallop. The town, once a hub of life, was now nothing more than a graveyard teeming with the dead. The distant screams of the survivors who hadn't made it out alive echoed faintly behind them, a haunting reminder of the nightmare they had barely escaped. Marty's heart pounded in his chest, his mind reeling from the horrors they had just witnessed. The image of the infected townspeople, those grotesque, decaying figures, was burned into his mind. It was like something out of a horror movie, except this time, there was no screen to separate him from the terror. This was real. Too real. "Doc, what the hell just happened back there?" Marty shouted, his voice breaking through the howling wind as their horses thundered across the desert plains. Doc, riding beside him, was pale, his expression grave as he tried to process everything. His white hair blew wildly in the wind, and for once, there was no excitement in his eyes, only fear. "I don't know, Marty," Doc replied, his voice unsteady. "I've seen many strange things in my lifetime, but this is something else entirely. It's like nothing we've ever encountered before." Marty gritted his teeth as they continued riding. The wind whipped through his hair, but even the cold bite of the evening air couldn't shake the sick feeling in his gut. "Are we talking some kind of disease? Or a plague?" Doc nodded, though his eyes were far away, lost in thought. "It must be, but nothing like we've ever seen in history. Whatever it is, it's spreading fast. The infection is highly aggressive. It turns people into those creatures." Marty's stomach twisted at the thought of what had become of the people in Hill Valley. "Zombies, Doc. They were like zombies, man." Doc's eyes flicked to Marty, his brow furrowing. "Zombies don't exist, Marty. At least, not in the way we understand them. But these people have lost all reason. Their bodies are decaying rapidly, yet they're still moving, still attacking. It defies everything we know about biology." Ahead of them, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the desert into shadow. The temperature dropped rapidly, the air growing cold and still. Marty pulled his jacket tighter, glancing over his shoulder to see if they were still being followed. To his relief, the infected weren't in sight, but that didn't mean they were safe. "Where are we going, Doc? We can't just keep running forever," Marty said, trying to keep his voice steady. Doc pointed ahead, where a small group of hills loomed in the distance. "There's an old fort just beyond those hills. It's been abandoned for years, but it might be the only place where we can regroup. Think of a plan. We need to figure out how widespread this infection is, and if there's any way to stop it." As they rode in silence, the gravity of their situation weighed down on both of them. Marty could feel the weight of fear pressing on his chest. The thought of Doc being wrong about the DeLorean's repair made him even more anxious. If they were trapped in this time period, surrounded by zombies, they might never get back. The fort came into view as they crested the final hill, its wooden walls weathered and half rotted, but still standing against the elements. It looked like a relic from a bygone era, an outpost long forgotten by the world. Marty and Doc slowed their horses, cautiously approaching the fort's gates. As they drew closer, the faint sound of movement reached their ears. Rustling footsteps, the unmistakable clink of metal. Marty's heart raced as he exchanged a worried glance with Doc. "You think the infection's reached this place too?" Marty whispered, gripping the reins tighter. Doc shook his head, though he didn't seem certain. "I don't know, but we need to be careful. There could be survivors, or worse." Marty felt his throat tighten. "Worse? You mean more of those things?" Doc didn't answer. Instead, he dismounted his horse and motioned for Marty to follow. Together, they approached the heavy wooden gate, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. "Hello?" Doc called out cautiously, his voice echoing through the still night air. Is anyone there? For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, with a slow creak, the gate swung open. Marty's pulse quickened as the gate revealed a small group of survivors, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes filled with fear and suspicion. They were armed, old rifles and shotguns clutched tightly in their hands, and they stood in a loose semicircle as if preparing for an attack. "What do you want?" one of the men barked, his voice rough and distrustful. Doc raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're not infected, I assure you. We're just looking for a place to rest. We've been fleeing the same terror you have." The group exchanged wary glances, but after a tense moment, the man nodded. "All right, get inside, quick. We don't leave the gate open for long." Marty and Doc hurried inside the fort as the gates were closed behind them, with a heavy thud. Inside, the fort was a grim sight. The survivors had set up makeshift barricades, blocking off the entrances with crates, barrels, and anything else they could find. A few fires burned in the center of the courtyard, casting flickering shadows over the group. Marty scanned the faces of the survivors, noting the weariness etched into their features. These people had seen things, bad things. Some of them looked like they hadn't slept in days. "We've been holed up here for weeks," one of the survivors explained, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek. "Ever since the infection started spreading. Thought we were safe here in the desert, but it's everywhere now. Towns falling left and right." Doc nodded grimly. "It's worse than we thought. We've only just come from Hill Valley, and the infection's already overwhelmed the town." Marty shivered at the memory. "What the hell is this anyway? Some kind of plague?" One of the survivors, a woman clutching a shotgun, shook her head. "Ain't no plague I've ever seen. People just change. It's like they die and come back, but they're not them anymore. Just monsters." Marty's mind raced. He had heard stories about the undead before, ghost tales, urban legends, but never in a million years had he thought he'd be living through one. Yet here he was, in the middle of the Wild West, surrounded by people who had watched their loved ones turn into bloodthirsty creatures. "Is there any way to stop it?" Marty asked, trying to suppress the fear rising in his chest. "Anything we can do?" The survivors exchanged glances, but none of them had an answer. Finally, the grizzled man spoke up. "We've heard rumors. People say there's a cure out there somewhere, but no one knows for sure. It might just be a story." Doc frowned, his mind clearly working overtime as he processed the information. "A cure? If such a thing exists, we need to find it. It might be our only chance." Before anyone could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows at the edge of the firelight. His tall, rugged frame was silhouetted against the flames, a shotgun slung over his shoulder. As he stepped into the light, his face became visible, worn, scarred, and hardened by years of battle. It was John Marston. "Cure or not," Marston said, his voice low and gravelly, "we're gonna need a hell of a lot more than stories to survive what's coming." Marty's eyes widened as he took in the sight of the infamous outlaw turned zombie slayer. He had heard the legends, John Marston, the man who had faced down the West's deadliest killers. And now, here he was, facing an even deadlier foe. Marston's eyes flicked to Doc and Marty, studying them carefully. "You two don't look like you're from around here," he said, his tone suspicious. Doc cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "We're travelers, passing through. We've encountered the infection just like you." Marston raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on them for a moment longer before nodding. "Well, travelers or not, you're stuck in this mess now, and it's only gonna get worse from here." That night, the survivors huddled together around the fire, sharing what little food they had left. Marty sat in silence, his mind still reeling from everything they had seen. The image of the infected townspeople, those hollow dead eyes, the twisted snarls, was burned into his brain. "I can't believe this is happening," Marty muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Doc, sitting beside him, was deep in thought. "It doesn't make sense, Marty. The infection spreads too fast, and the behavior of the infected, it defies all logic. There must be some underlying cause, some scientific explanation." Marty shook his head. "Doc, there's no explaining this. It's like a horror movie. Zombies, the undead, whatever you want to call it. It's real, and it's here." Doc didn't respond, his mind clearly working overtime, as he tried to make sense of the situation. But Marty knew that even Doc couldn't science his way out of this one. This was beyond them, beyond anything they could have prepared for. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, Marston approached the group, his expression grim. "I scouted the area," he said, his voice low. "The infection's spreading faster than I thought. Towns all over the frontier are falling. There's no running from it." Marty felt a chill run down his spine. "So what do we do?" Marston's gaze was cold, his eyes hardened from years of survival. "We fight." The early morning sun filtered through the cracks in the fort's wooden walls, casting long, narrow beams of light across the dirt floor. The survivors gathered near the fire, their faces gaunt and hollow from sleepless nights. Marty and Doc sat apart from the rest, their expressions grim as they discussed their next steps. The infection was spreading fast, faster than either of them could have anticipated. They had to act, and soon. John Marston leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowed as he watched the horizon. The infected had not yet reached the fort, but that didn't mean they were safe. He knew it was only a matter of time before the undead swarmed this place, just like they had done to countless other towns. They had to leave, but where to? Everywhere they turned, death followed. "What's the plan, Doc?" Marty asked, his voice low but laced with urgency. His eyes darted toward the gates where the survivors kept a watchful eye on the landscape. "We can't just sit here. We've got to do something." Doc Brown rubbed his temples, exhaustion etched into his face. His normally bright eyes were dull, weighed down by the crushing reality of their situation. "Marty, I don't have all the answers. But if there's even the slightest chance we can find a solution, we have to try." "Ingenio." John Marston walked over, his boots crunching on the dusty floor. His weathered face was impassive, but there was a fire behind his eyes, an unbreakable will to survive. "I've heard rumors about a place west of here, a mining town. Some say it's already been wiped out, but others say they've got supplies. Maybe even a way to stop this mess. If there's a cure, it ain't gonna come easy, but it might be our best shot." "A mining town?" Marty asked, doubt clouding his voice. "Are you sure it's worth the risk?" Marston shrugged, his lips curling into a grim smile. "Ain't nothing in this world that comes without risk, kid, but sitting here waiting for those things to overrun us ain't an option." Doc nodded, the wheels in his mind already turning. "If there are supplies there, anything we can use to fix the DeLorean or find a cure, we need to investigate. But we'll need a plan. We can't just ride into the heart of danger unprepared." Marston grunted, clearly used to taking risks head on. "Prepared or not, those things are coming. We leave at first light." The survivors in the fort listened, their eyes wide with fear. No one wanted to leave the relative safety of the fort, but they knew deep down it was only a temporary reprieve. The undead were relentless, and the walls wouldn't hold forever. By the time the sun had fully risen, The fort had quieted down. The survivors who remained were too terrified to join the expedition, opting instead to hold out as long as they could within the fort's walls. So it was just the three of them, Marty, Doc, and Marston, setting out across the barren landscape, heading west toward the mining town. The desert was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife replaced by the haunting stillness of the infected plague. The wind stirred the dust as the horses trudged through the dry, cracked earth. Marty kept his eyes on the horizon, scanning for any sign of movement. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. Every gust of wind carried the stench of death. The tension hung heavy in the air as they rode, each man lost in his own thoughts. Marty's mind raced with fear and doubt. How had things gone so wrong so quickly? They had only been trying to get home, to fix the DeLorean and escape this time period. But now, the very fabric of the past had been torn apart by an infection that defied all logic. And now, they were riding headlong into what could very well be their deaths. "Doc," Marty said, breaking the silence. "How are we supposed to stop something like this? This infection? It's not like anything we've ever seen." Doc pulled his hat lower over his face, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know, Marty. It's unlike any disease I've ever encountered. It spreads too quickly, and the effects are beyond anything we understand. But there must be a cause, something we're missing." Marston, riding ahead, spoke without turning around. "All the science in the world ain't gonna save us from what's out here. Sometimes you just have to put a bullet in the problem and hope it stays down." Marty frowned, his fingers gripping the reins tightly. "I don't think it's that simple, Marston. There has to be more to this, something we can do." Marston chuckled darkly, his voice cold and hardened. "Kid, I've seen enough of this world to know one thing. When the dead start walking, it ain't about understanding. It's about surviving." The day dragged on as they rode through the desolate landscape, the sun beating down on them with relentless heat. By the time they reached the outskirts of the mining town, the sky had begun to darken, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the once thriving town was now little more than a ghostly ruin. The buildings were dilapidated, their wooden walls creaking in the wind. Windows were shattered, doors hung loosely from their hinges, and the streets were littered with debris. But worse than the physical destruction was the silence, the oppressive, suffocating silence that filled the town. There were no signs of life, only death. "This place has been hit hard," Marston muttered, dismounting his horse and gripping his shotgun tightly. "Stay sharp. There could be more of those things around." Marty and Doc followed suit, their eyes scanning the surrounding buildings for any signs of movement. The eerie quiet was unnerving, like the calm before the storm. "Do you think anyone's still alive here?" Marty whispered, stepping cautiously toward one of the buildings. Doc shook his head, though he didn't look certain. "I doubt it. If the infection reached here, there may not be any survivors left." As they moved deeper into the town, the signs of devastation became more apparent. Bloodstains marked the ground, and in the distance they could see the twisted forms of the infected, mangled bodies that had once been people, now nothing more than husks, driven by a hunger for flesh. "Search the buildings," Marston said, his voice low and commanding. "We need to find anything useful, supplies, weapons, information. If we're gonna survive this, we need to be ready for anything." Marty and Doc split up, moving cautiously through the ruined town. Marty entered one of the buildings, his heart racing as he stepped over broken furniture and shattered glass. The inside of the building was even worse than the outside. Signs of a struggle were everywhere. Blood smeared across the walls. Overturned tables and discarded weapons lay scattered across the floor. He tried not to think about what had happened to the people who had once lived here. As he moved further into the building, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement in the corner of the room, small but unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat as he turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol tucked in his belt. There, huddled in the corner, was a young boy, no older than 12. His clothes were torn and blood-stained, and his eyes were wide with fear. He stared at Marty, too frightened to speak. "Hey," Marty said softly, lowering his gun as he stepped closer. "It's okay, I'm not gonna hurt you." The boy didn't move, his body trembling as he stared at Marty in terror. Marty knelt down, keeping his voice calm and steady. "We're here to help. Are there any other survivors?" The boy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "They're all gone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The monsters took them." Marty's stomach twisted. He knew what that meant. "Doc," Marty called out, turning toward the door. "I found someone." Doc and Marston hurried into the building, their expressions grim as they took in the sight of the terrified boy. "Poor kid," Marston muttered, kneeling down beside him. "What happened here, son?" The boy sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. "The sickness. It came so fast. Everyone got sick, and then they started changing, turning into those things. My PA tried to fight them off, but they got him too. Now it's just me." Doc placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "You're safe with us now. We're going to get out of here." The boy nodded, though his eyes were still filled with fear. "They're still here," he whispered. "I can hear them at night. They come back sometimes, looking for anyone who's still alive." Marston exchanged a glance with Doc, his expression dark. "We need to move fast. If those things are still around, we can't stay here for long." And then, as they began searching the rest of the town, the tension grew. The silence weighed heavily on them, each creak of the windswept buildings making Marty's nerves jump. His hands trembled on his pistol as they moved from building to building, hoping to find anything that could help. But then, as they turned a corner near the old saloon, the stillness shattered. A horrifying moan echoed through the empty street, sending a jolt of terror through Marty's spine. The infected were here. Before he could react, the undead surged from the shadows, twisted, decayed figures lurching toward them with terrifying speed. Their eyes burned with hunger, their mouths hanging open in snarls of rage. They moved faster than Marty expected, their decaying bodies almost a blur as they closed in. "Back," Marston shouted, raising his shotgun and firing into the horde. The blast echoed across the empty town, but for every zombie that fell, two more seemed to take its place. Marty's heart raced as he aimed his pistol and fired, the sound of gunfire filling the air. The creatures kept coming, relentless, their grotesque bodies contorting as they clawed at the air. Beside him, Doc swung a makeshift weapon, a broken piece of wood, fighting to keep the monsters at bay. "We have to get out of here," Doc shouted, knocking one of the undead to the ground. Marston's face was a mask of determination as he reloaded. But even he knew they were outnumbered. "We're not gonna last much longer if we don't move." Marty's breath came in ragged gasps as he fired again and again, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and if they didn't escape soon, they'd be overrun. The gunfire echoed through the desolate mining town, each shot a desperate plea for survival. The infected poured out of the ruined buildings like a flood of decay and death. their grotesque forms lurching forward, driven by an insatiable hunger. Marty's heart pounded in his angular chest as he emptied the remaining bullets from his pistol into the advancing horde, the acrid smell of gunpowder and rot filling the air. Beside him, John Marston fired his shotgun with grim precision, each blast tearing through the oncoming mass of undead. But no matter how many they put down, more seemed to rise in their place, shambling out of the shadows and advancing with horrifying speed. "Doc," Marty shouted over the chaos, his voice hoarse with fear and adrenaline. "We've got to get out of here. They're everywhere." Doc Brown, usually calm under pressure, was struggling to keep his footing as the horde closed in. His face was pale, his breaths ragged as he swung a broken plank at the nearest infected, knocking one to the ground. His eyes darted wildly, the panic setting in. They were outnumbered. They had to retreat. But before Doc could respond, the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The infected surged forward in an overwhelming wave, their decaying hands outstretched, their moans deafening. Marty could feel his pulse in his ears, could hear his own labored breathing as he fought to keep the creatures at bay. For every one they killed, two more appeared, their dead eyes filled with an unnatural hunger. "We can't hold them off," Marston growled, his voice thick with tension as he reloaded his shotgun. "We need to fall back now." Marty nodded, fear clawing at his throat. "Doc, come on," he yelled, glancing back at Doc, who was struggling to keep the infected at a distance. But then, in an instant, everything changed. It happened so fast. Marty's eyes flicked toward Doc just as a group of undead broke through the defensive line they had tried to establish. In a blur of motion, three of the creatures lunged at Doc, their twisted, rotting bodies crashing into him with a sickening thud. "Doc," Marty screamed, his heart dropping as he watched in horror. Doc staggered backward, his arms flailing as the zombies grabbed hold of him, their skeletal fingers clawing at his clothes and skin. He swung his makeshift weapon, trying to fend them off, but they were too many, too strong. The undead, driven by mindless hunger, sank their teeth into his arm, ripping through his flesh with terrifying ease. The sound of Doc's scream cut through the air like a knife. A sound of pure agony and fear that chilled Marty to his core. Blood poured from the wound, soaking into the dirt as the infected bit down again, their teeth tearing into Doc's skin with savage force. Marty's hands trembled, his mind racing as he took a step toward his mentor. But Marston grabbed him by the arm, pulling him back. "Marty, it's too late," Marston barked, his voice filled with grim finality. "He's done for." "No," Marty shouted, his voice breaking. "We can't just leave him. We can't." But it was too late. As Marty watched, helpless, the infected swarmed Doc, their decaying faces contorting into grotesque snarls as they tore into him. Doc's body crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him as the zombies feasted, their mouths stained red with his blood. The light in Doc's eyes flickered, fading as his screams were drowned out by the chorus of moans from the horde. Marty's vision blurred with tears, his body trembling as the reality of what was happening crashed down on him. Doc, his friend, his mentor, was gone, torn apart by the very monsters they had been trying to escape. Marston yanked on Marty's arm, pulling him back toward the alley. "We can't save him, kid," he said, his voice harsh but urgent. "He's gone. If we don't move now, we'll end up just like him." Marty stumbled backward, his mind numb with shock and disbelief. Everything around him felt like a nightmare, like something that couldn't possibly be real. But the sight of Doc's bloodied, lifeless body, surrounded by the feeding undead, told him otherwise. This was real, and there was nothing he could do. Marty's legs moved on instinct as he followed Marston through the narrow streets of the mining town, his mind still reeling from the loss of Doc. The world around him felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the walls of the town closing in as the infected swarmed from every direction. The sounds of moaning and shambling feet echoed in his ears, but all he could think about was the look on Doc's face in those final moments, the sheer terror in his eyes as the creatures tore into him. "Keep it together," Marston barked, firing off another round from his shotgun as they rounded a corner only to be met with more of the undead. "You want to die here too? Get your head straight, kid." Marty snapped out of his daze, the sharpness of Marston's words cutting through the fog of grief that had clouded his mind. He raised his pistol, firing at the nearest zombie, watching as it crumpled to the ground. His hands were shaking, his heart racing, but he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving, had to survive. "We need to find higher ground," Marston yelled, his voice strained as he reloaded his shotgun. "They'll corner us if we stay down here." Marty nodded, trying to push the image of Doc's death out of his mind, as they climbed a set of rickety wooden stairs that led to the second floor of an old saloon. From there, they could see the full extent of the chaos that had overtaken the town. The streets were crawling with the undead, their decayed bodies shuffling aimlessly as they searched for fresh meat. Buildings burned in the distance, sending thick plumes of smoke into the darkening sky. The world had become a hellscape, and Marty felt like he was trapped in the middle of a waking nightmare. "Where do we go from here?" Marty asked, his voice hoarse as he reloaded his pistol with trembling hands. Marston stood beside him, his jaw clenched as he surveyed the town. "We keep moving. We can't stay here." Marty looked out over the ruined landscape, his eyes brimming with tears. "What's the point? Doc's gone. Everyone's gone. How are we supposed to stop this?" Marston turned to him, his face hardened but not unkind. "You stop it by staying alive. That's all that matters now. You fight, you survive, and you figure out how to make it out of this mess. Don't let your friend's death be for nothing." Marty swallowed hard, the weight of Marston's words settling on his chest like a boulder. He wiped at his eyes, trying to push down the grief and the guilt that threatened to overwhelm him. He had to keep going, for Doc. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep shade of crimson, casting an ominous glow over the town. The infected continued to swarm below, their moans filling the air like a chorus of death. Marty and Marston crouched on the rooftop, their breaths shallow as they waited for a moment of reprieve. Marty couldn't stop thinking about Doc, about the way he had screamed, the way his body had crumpled under the weight of the infected. The image haunted him, replaying over and over in his mind. He had lost more than a friend. He had lost the man who had guided him through time and space, the man who had always been there to pull him out of danger. And now, he was gone, taken by the very monsters they had been trying to escape. Marston lit a cigarette, the faint glow of the ember casting shadows on his weathered face. "The kid from the mining town," he muttered, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "You think he's still alive?" Marty shook his head. "I don't know. I hope so. But with those things out there..." His voice trailed off, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a lead blanket. They had come here hoping to find supplies, hoping to find answers, but all they had found was death. Marston flicked the cigarette away, standing up and stretching his shoulders. "We need to get out of here before more of them show up. The longer we stay, the less chance we have of surviving the night." Marty stood, the exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "Where do we go?" Marston glanced at him, his eyes cold but resolute. "West. There's nothing left for us here." With one last look at the burning town below, the two survivors began their descent from the rooftop, leaving the ruins and the memory of Doc Brown behind. The sky had turned a bruised purple as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The air was thick with tension as Marty and John Marston stood before the entrance to an ancient Aztec temple, half buried beneath the rocky desert. The structure loomed ominously in the fading light, its stone walls covered in vines and weathered carvings, symbols that spoke of an ancient, terrible power. Marston held his shotgun close, his eyes scanning the temple's entrance with grim resolve. "This is it," he muttered, "the source of all this madness." Marty swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their mission pressing down on him. They had tracked the origin of the infection across the frontier, following rumors and cryptic stories until it had led them here, to a forgotten relic of the past. The Aztec mask, said to be imbued with dark magic, was what had caused the dead to rise, bringing the apocalypse down upon the Old West. "This thing caused all of this?" Marty asked, his voice shaky. Marston nodded, his face hard as stone. "The mask. It brought the dead back to life. If we destroy it, maybe we can stop this nightmare." But as they approached the entrance, the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. A low rumble echoed from within the temple, followed by the distant, unmistakable sound of the infected. Marty's heart raced as he turned to Marston, panic rising in his chest. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. The infected, drawn by the mask's power, were already closing in. The sound of their moaning filled the air like a deathly chorus, growing louder with each passing second. Marston's grip tightened on his shotgun as he turned to face the approaching horde. "Let's move," Marston barked, and the two of them rushed into the temple, their footsteps echoing through the narrow stone corridors. The inside of the temple was a labyrinth of twisting passageways, lit only by the flickering light of their torches. The walls were lined with ancient carvings telling the story of the mask's creation, a relic forged by dark magic capable of controlling life and death. But there was no time to study the history. The infected were close behind, their guttural moans growing louder as they pursued their prey. "We need to find that mask and get out of here," Marty gasped, his voice echoing off the walls as they ran deeper into the temple. Marston nodded, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. "It's gotta be in the main chamber. That's where the power is coming from." As they pushed deeper into the heart of the temple, the air grew colder, thicker with an otherworldly energy. The walls seemed to pulse with dark magic, and the weight of the place pressed down on them like a physical force. The infected were close now, too close. The sound of their footfalls echoed behind them, accompanied by the sickening squelch of decaying flesh. Finally, they reached the main chamber. The chamber was vast, its ceiling disappearing into darkness high above. At the center of the room, raised on an ancient stone altar, was the mask. It gleamed in the torchlight, its surface covered in intricate carvings, its eye sockets dark and hollow. Marty felt a chill run down his spine as he stared at the object, its very presence radiating malevolence. "There it is," Marston muttered, stepping forward cautiously. "That's the thing that started all this." But before they could reach it, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The walls of the chamber seemed to shudder, and the sound of the infected grew deafening. Marty spun around, his heart hammering in his chest as the entrance to the chamber was filled with undead, dozens of them, their eyes glowing with a sickly green light. "We're trapped," Marty yelled, his voice cracking with fear. Marston's jaw clenched as he raised his shotgun, firing into the mass of undead that surged toward them. Each blast took down a handful of the creatures, But there were too many. They kept coming, their decayed bodies piling up as more and more filled the chamber. "Grab the mask," Marston shouted over the din. "We need to get the hell out of here." Marty rushed toward the altar, his hands trembling as he reached for the mask. But as his fingers brushed the surface, a shockwave of dark energy erupted from the object, knocking him backward. The force of the blast sent him crashing into the stone wall, his vision swimming as he struggled to regain his bearings. Marston fired another round, but the undead were closing in. The temple was collapsing around them, the power of the mask too great to be contained. Marty staggered to his feet, his head pounding as he looked around in desperation. "We can't get to it," Marty yelled, panic flooding his voice. "The mask, it's too powerful." Marston's face was grim as he fired his last shot, the sound of the gun clicking empty echoing through the chamber. The infected were nearly upon them, their twisted faces snarling with hunger. "We're out of options, kid," Marston muttered, backing up towards Marty. "We're not gonna make it." The horde closed in, their decaying hands reaching for them, teeth bared in anticipation. Marty's heart pounded in his chest as he realized there was no way out. They were trapped. This was the end. But then, through the chaos, Marty's eyes landed on something familiar, something that gave him hope. The DeLorean. It had been parked outside, hidden from sight, but as the temple collapsed around them, the stone ceiling gave way, revealing the DeLorean, half buried beneath the rubble. "We have to get to the car," Marty shouted, grabbing Marston by the arm. "It's our only chance." Without another word, they bolted for the DeLorean, dodging the grasping hands of the undead as they sprinted through the crumbling temple. The ground shook beneath their feet as the walls of the chamber collapsed around them, debris raining down as they ran. Marty reached the car first, throwing open the door and jumping inside. Marston followed close behind, slamming the door shut just as the first of the undead reached them, their hands pounding against the glass. "Punch it," Marston yelled, his voice filled with urgency. Marty didn't need to be told twice. He flipped the switch, activating the time circuits, and gunned the engine. The DeLorean's tires screeched against the stone floor as it shot forward, leaving the temple and the horde of undead behind. As the car picked up speed, the world outside blurred, the fabric of time bending around them. The infected reached for the DeLorean, but they were too late. With a flash of light and a deafening roar, the DeLorean disappeared, hurtling through time. When the world stopped spinning, Marty opened his eyes, his heart still racing from the near-death experience. They had made it, but where were they? The familiar landscape of the Old West spread out before them, the town of Hill Valley just visible on the horizon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. But something was different. This wasn't the same Hill Valley they had just left. It was the beginning of their journey. The beginning of Back to the Future, Part 3. "We're back," Marty muttered, his voice filled with disbelief. Marston frowned, looking at the window. Back where? Marty's mind raced as he realized what had happened. They had traveled back in time, to the moment before everything had gone wrong. But the mask, it was still out there. The infection, the nightmare, it was all about to begin again. "Doc," Marty whispered, his heart sinking as he realized the enormity of what had just happened. Doc was still alive in this timeline, but they were right back where they started. The mask was still out there, and the infection would soon follow. The dusty landscape of the Old West sprawled before Marty McFly and John Marston as they stared out at the town of Hill Valley. The familiar sight brought a wave of nostalgia to Marty, but it was laced with dread. This wasn't just any trip back to the past. This was the start of everything. The infection, the nightmare, Doc's death. All of it was about to unfold again. But this time, they had a chance to stop it. "We have to fix this," Marty muttered, his voice filled with determination as they stood next to the DeLorean, parked just outside the town limits. "We can't let the mask trigger the outbreak again." Marston nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "But we've got another problem, kid." Marty followed his gaze, noticing something strange. His hand, it was starting to fade. Panic surged through him as he looked down at his fingers, which were slowly becoming translucent, like a ghost fading from view. "What the hell?" Marty gasped, his heart pounding in his chest. Marston too had begun to fade, his form flickering like a distorted image. "We're from the timeline with the infection," he explained, his voice grim. "A timeline that shouldn't exist anymore. The more we change things, the more we disappear." Marty's stomach twisted with fear. "So we're running out of time." "Exactly," Marston said, loading his shotgun with a sharp click. "We have to stop this before we fade completely." But as they turned toward the town, something else dawned on Marty. The other Marty, his younger self, was still here, living out the events of Back to the Future, Part 3. If they crossed paths with him, it could cause irreparable damage to the timeline, potentially making things even worse. "We can't let the other me see us," Marty said, his voice filled with urgency. "We have to avoid him at all costs." Marston raised an eyebrow. "So we're sneaking around, huh? Not my favorite way to do things, but I get it." The town of Hill Valley was alive with the familiar sights and sounds of the Old West. As Marty and Marston made their way through the streets, they kept to the shadows, avoiding eye contact with the townsfolk. Marty's heart raced as he saw glimpses of his younger self, dressed in cowboy garb, talking with Doc and Clara. It felt surreal, like watching a movie play out in front of him, only this time, he couldn't intervene. "We need to get to the mask," Marty whispered, ducking behind a row of barrels as he saw Doc Brown pass by, on his way to the blacksmith's. "Before it's too late." Marston's eyes were sharp as they scanned the streets. "If that mask is still out there, it's probably in the same temple we found it in. But if Doc's still alive in this timeline, we might need him to help us get to it." Marty hesitated. Doc, his best friend, was alive again. In this timeline, they hadn't yet faced the horrors of the undead, but revealing the truth to him could unravel everything. "We can't tell him," Marty said, his voice pained. "He's better off not knowing." Marston grunted. "Then we find that mask ourselves." As the sun set over the desert, Marty and Marston rode hard toward the ancient temple where they had first encountered the mask. The landscape around them was eerily familiar, but with every passing moment, Marty felt himself fading more. His fingers, once translucent, were now barely visible, and Marston's entire form flickered like a dying flame. They reached the temple just as darkness fell, the crumbling stone walls looming before them like a tomb. The same malevolent energy pulsed from within, but now Marty could sense it more clearly. The dark magic of the mask was corrupting everything around it. "We've got to destroy it," Marty muttered, as they approached the entrance. But just as they stepped inside, the ground shook beneath them. The temple seemed to come alive, as if sensing their intent. The walls groaned and cracked, and the air filled with the sound of shifting stone. The infected might not be here yet, but the mask's power was just as dangerous. "Move," Marston shouted, grabbing Marty by the arm as they sprinted deeper into the temple. They reached the main chamber, and there it was. The mask, resting on the altar just as they had left it. But as Marty reached for it, he hesitated. His hand was barely visible now, a faint outline of what it once was. "I don't know if I can touch it," Marty said, his voice shaking. "I'm barely even here anymore." Marston stepped forward, his eyes hard. Then I'll do it. He grabbed the mask, his hands trembling as the dark energy surged through him. The air crackled with power, and the ground beneath them rumbled ominously. But Marston held on, his grip firm. We destroy this thing. We end the infection, he growled through gritted teeth, one way or another. Just as they prepared to destroy the mask, a voice called out from the entrance to the chamber. Marty, is that you? Marty's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see Doc Brown standing in the doorway, his face filled with shock and confusion. He had followed them, unknowingly stumbling into the same nightmare Marty had tried to avoid. Doc, Marty gasped, his voice barely audible as he began to fade even more. You can't be here. Doc's eyes widened as he took in the sight of Marty and Marston, both of them half transparent, their forms flickering like ghosts. Great Scott, what's happening to you? Marty struggled to speak, but his voice was fading along with his body. It's the mask. We're from the future, a future that shouldn't exist. Doc's face twisted in horror as he realized the gravity of the situation. You're fading because the timeline is correcting itself. But if you destroy the mask, the infection... We have no choice, Marston shouted. If we don't end this now, the infection will spread again. Doc hesitated, his mind racing as he tried to think of a solution. But there was no time. The temple was collapsing around them, the dark energy of the mask threatening to consume everything. Do it, Doc finally said, his voice trembling with emotion. Destroy the mask. Marston raised the mask above his head, his face grim with determination. With a final roar, he slammed it down onto the altar, shattering it into pieces. A wave of dark energy exploded from the mask, filling the chamber with blinding light. Marty felt his body surge with power, but instead of pain, there was relief. The infection, the darkness, was gone. The mask had been destroyed. As the light faded, so did Marty and Marston. Their bodies, once flickering, began to fade completely. It's over, Marty whispered, his voice weak as he looked at Doc one last time. I'm sorry, Doc. I couldn't save you. Doc's eyes were filled with tears as he reached out to his friend, but his hand passed through Marty's fading form. Marty, you've done more than enough. You saved all of us. Marty smiled weakly, his body disappearing piece by piece. I'll miss you, Doc. And with that, Marty and Marston were gone, erased from the timeline, their mission complete. When Marty opened his eyes again, he was lying on the dusty ground outside the town of Hill Valley. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and there were no signs of the infection. The town was alive, bustling with life. He sat up, confused, but relieved. The nightmare was over. The infection had never happened. The mask had been destroyed. As he stood, he saw Doc approaching from a distance, a smile on his face. Marty, you're all right. Marty grinned, feeling the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. Yeah, Doc, I think we did it. And for the first time, in what felt like forever, everything was back to the way it was supposed to be.